You're listening to The Pulse on AMI Audio. I'm Grant Hardy. The Federal Court of Appeal in Air Canada versus Timothy Rose et al. Upheld a decision ordering Air Canada to accommodate persons with disabilities who use mobility devices. Their precedent-setting decision was released last month, marking a significant turning point in a fight for airline accessibility that began over 8 years ago. Arch Disability Law Centre, along with Legal Aid Ontario's Clinic Resource Office, represented Tim to defend the Canadian Transportation Agency's decision that it would not cause Air Canada undue hardship to substitute an aircraft. Joining me today to chat more about this issue is Tim Rose himself, a power wheelchair user. Joining us from the UK, but he's from Toronto. Also joining the conversation is Ilinca Stefan, a staff lawyer at the Arch Disability Law Centre. Tim, Ilinca, thank you so much for joining us on The Pulse.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Ilinca, I wanted to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about the Arch Disability Law Centre, your role, and the type of work that you folks do?
Sure. So thank you so much for having me. As you mentioned, I am a lawyer at Arch Disability Law Centre. So Arch's mandate is really to advance inclusion of persons with disabilities and defend and advance their rights, which includes in transportation. So Arch has a mandate to serve the entire province of Ontario. And we do that in a number of different ways throughout our legal practice, whether that's through strategic litigation, law reform, policy changes, public legal education. And I just want to shout out our summary advice and referral service to persons with disabilities in Ontario in a number of areas of law.
Disability representation on disability law, especially transportation, so important because, Tim, as a person with a disability, almost everybody has had some sort of incident, I think, especially with air travel. So maybe not quite as severe as what happened with you. So can you describe what happened in 2016 there and the efforts you made to try and resolve the issue with Air Canada?
Yeah, absolutely, Grant. So what happened in 2016 was I was trying to fly for a second time from Toronto to Cleveland, Ohio. I had been asked by a company based in Cleveland to come and do a presentation, ironically enough, about disability in big business. I didn't really think anything of it because I had flown that exact same route the year before for another speaking opportunity. So when I went to book the flight and was told that my wheelchair would not fit on the plane, on the type of plane that was serving that route, my first reaction was one of confusion because I didn't understand how last year, like the year previous, I could take the flight no problem, and then now I was being told that I couldn't, and that really, really didn't sit right with me. But what didn't sit right with me to an even greater extent was when I was told, look, it's just like an oversized piece of luggage. If it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. And so that's what really sparked my frustration and my anger with the system in general. And that's when I took the story to social media, and from there to other sources of traditional media. And once it had kind of garnered a fair bit of attention back in 2016, I reached out to Arch and asked if they would like to be involved in the case. And luckily for me, the great organization that they are, and I can't sing their praises loudly enough, stepped forward and offered me legal representation. I don't think any of us thought that it would take 8 years to get to the point that we've gotten to, but so that's what happened in 2016.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you're kind of like, okay, this person on, the phone is just being a little rude. Can you just put me through to someone who knows what they're talking about? And then you're like, oh, you actually mean it.
Yeah, no, and I was really Honestly, I was surprised that Air Canada was so kind of glib about the whole thing at the time. Like not even offering me a free flight. Not, normally if your flight is delayed, you at least get a food voucher. And here I
Mm,
was being told that I could not fly at all, which was a direct infringement upon my rights as a passenger. And I was offered absolutely nothing. And even when the Air Canada customer service manager did get in touch with me after a few days of media coverage, their responses were quite simply unsatisfactory and rude.
mm. Yeah, it definitely sounds like that attitude was present throughout their whole quote unquote non-resolution process here. Um, Before we move on, I just have to ask you, what exactly did you do at that time to make it to Ohio? Were you able to get there eventually?
Yeah, so what we ended up doing was renting a wheelchair van, and a really good friend of mine who was very passionate about the case and passionate about disability justice actually offered to take a few days off work and drive me down to Cleveland.
Oh,
In
geez.
the absence of any solution provided by the people that should have been providing solutions,
Yeah,
Air Canada, I had to look elsewhere, and thankfully a friend stepped forward.
but a pretty outrageous solution that you had to implement, even though it's lucky you had that. And so, Tim, I'm just curious. We are all taught to learn those advocacy skills, self advocate for ourselves. But like, there is a certain point where you just have to stop talking and go to the court, start litigating. How did you, I guess, draw that line for yourself, or where should we be drawing that line, do you think?
I mean, the reality is, Grant, that most people with disabilities aren't going to be able to stop a national airline from
Mm,
discriminating against them without the support of the legal system, right? We are individuals going up against large companies with billion-dollar profits,
mhm,
multi-billion-dollar profits. And so, without the courts stepping in and mandating a solution, then nothing would ever change, right? And so I'm not saying in any way that grassroots advocacy is not important, because it's grassroots advocacy that got my story out there. It's grassroots advocacy that connected me with Ilinca and the team at Arch. It's grassroots advocacy that really raised the volume on this issue at the time and even beyond. But the reality is that without legal mandates and without the courts stepping forward and structuring
mhm.
solutions for large organizations, then I don't think we would see a whole lot of change. And that's kind of the realization that I had to come to in this case.
Elenka, anything you'd like to add onto that?
Sure. So I totally agree that sometimes without litigation, nothing changes. And I think this case is a good example because throughout, the entire 8 years, Air Canada put up barriers, quite literal barriers and legal barriers at every step of the case. And I can't tell you how much work went into this from the entire team at Arch, from Legal Aid Ontario and the Clinic Resource Office. And it's alarming that it has to take that amount of effort and that amount of time for things to actually change. Because I think what we're realizing is that these changes would not have happened without the transportation agency and the court.
Can you tell me, Elenka, a little bit about how this case, you know, how this case worked its way through the courts? What were your arguments? What were Air Canada's arguments? What was what was this whole 8 year process like?
Sure. So I was only very closely involved for the last 2 or so years of it. This case actually took so long that I was a law student at the time that it had started and was working on this file as a law student at Arch. And in the time it actually took to make its way to a decision of the Canadian Transportation Agency. I actually became like a legally trained lawyer in the meantime. So that's just some context of how long it took. So I can't speak to the entire thing. So it was an application at the Canadian Transportation Agency, which is a specialized quasi judicial tribunal that specifically deals with a number of things in federal transportation, but human rights in federal transportation. So normally, the way these things go is someone makes a complaint to the Canadian Transportation Agency, and then, it usually gets resolved pretty quick. It gets resolved, in writing. There might be some sort of settlement. But what we saw is Air Canada not budging at all. Throughout the proceeding, it became clear that it wasn't just him that was affected by this one route to Cleveland from Toronto. It was a number of transborder routes, which really spoke to the systemic nature of Air Canada's route selection and aircraft selection. And so because of that, the agency actually found it important to set up an oral hearing, which is very rare for the agency to do. But that led to a 2-day oral hearing where, Air Canada brought all of their witnesses, and there was testimony and, cross-examination and closing statements. So really quite an in-depth process. And then what happened when Tim was waiting for the decision is in 2020, of course, the pandemic started. And so Air Canada kind of wanted to restart the case over again. So Air Canada said, listen, the airline industry is totally different now. We actually want to submit all new evidence and kind of re-argue why we shouldn't be required to accommodate to the extent that you're asking us to accommodate.
So essentially, as I understand it, their argument was that substituting one aircraft for an accessible one that could accommodate slightly larger dimensions of a wheelchair, even having 3 weeks notice, would cause, quote, undue hardship to the airline.
The reality is, Grant, that airlines switch aircraft all the time, right? Whether it's because of a mechanical issue, whether it's because of weather, whether it's because of whatever else, or they add additional planes for large events, things like the Olympics or, whatever. So like there are changes made to routes all the time. And so Ilinca, sorry if I'm stealing your thunder there, but like that is the, like, the reality is that swapping out aircraft is not an undue hardship. It's just not, because they do it almost every day.
Yeah. Might be a big deal to a, private like pilot, Joe Schmo who owns an airplane, whatever, but a like multi-billion-dollar airline, like it's no sweat at all. Yeah. Ilinca, anything you'd like to add to that there?
Yes. So I did find a list of sort of all of the accommodations that were initially requested that the Canadian Transportation Agency initially found would constitute undue hardship. So, of course, ideally transporting Tim or any other person who uses a wheelchair or mobility device in the passenger cabin, trying to... Initially, we had asked for permanent replacement of the aircraft used on the Toronto-Cleveland route. And then that's eventually how we got to ad hoc substitution of aircraft, because Air Canada presented all of this evidence, as Tim was saying, about all of the route switches that happen all of the time for mechanical reasons or weather-related reasons or big events. And so the question really was, why can you do that all the time? And as Air Canada testified, we can do it with basically no notice, and we do that all the time. So the question was, why can't you do that as a disability-related accommodation? And then that's also sort of the last resort accommodation that the agency ordered and that the Federal Court of Appeal upheld. Because Air Canada, the majority of the time, is able to find alternative routes to book people on.
Tim, sorry, did you want to add something to that? Or?
No,
Okay,
that was great. Yeah, no, that was great.
Maybe say something. Yeah, so essentially the court order, the court upheld that Air Canada would have to not only accommodate this type of circumstances, but also to disclose how they plan to improve services for passengers with disabilities, such as those individuals in wheelchairs, through the Accessible Canada Act. I just wanted to get both of your reactions on this ruling, first of all. Tim, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think my reactions on the overall ruling, honestly, Grant, was one of relief. This has been a very, very long journey for both Ilinca and myself. I know she said she's only been primary on the case for 2 years, but a lot longer than that in following. And there's so many other staff people at Arch that I need to thank for sticking it out with me for 8 years, because a lot of legal firms and agencies would have walked away a long time ago in the face of what is very much a David versus Goliath battle. So, I think relief, but also vindication, right? I had so many people when the story first broke in the media trying to tell me how entitled I was and how I was being ridiculous and how I was being unreasonable and how airlines would never ever switch planes, including from some people with disabilities who I think had just kind of accepted the path that people with disability just can't fly certain places, and I didn't accept that. And so I think if I can summarize my very complex emotions into words, which seems like a bit of an oversimplification, it would be relief and kind of visceral vindication.
Yeah, I see how it would be less of a celebration and more just the feeling of righting a wrong that should have never had to be advocated for in the beginning. And
Yeah.
and certainly, it's very interesting, isn't it? I think a lot of individuals with disabilities, because we've been told we have to be grateful for kind of anything and everything that we can get, we kind of pin that on each other, don't we? We're like, I don't want to be the one to, cause a stir. I'm just going to kind of say, I'm grateful for anything I can get. It's an interesting dynamic, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think a lot of people with disabilities, because we live in a society that isn't designed for us, we are scared to rock the boat. I was very fortunate to be raised by two parents who not only encouraged me to rock the boat, but kind of taught me how to do it. And so, I'm grateful for that upbringing, and I'm grateful for them, giving me the voice at a young age to speak up for myself. But I recognize that not everyone with a disability has that privilege. And so if I can use my voice for the good of others, then that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, and that's really cool. And thank you for working to advocate for yourself and for the community as well. Ilinca, what's your reaction to the decision here?
Sure. So I just want to point out, you mentioned the order under the Accessible Canada Act, and I just want to. Sorry, was my mic okay?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. So you had mentioned the order under the Accessible Canada Act. So on the accessibility plan order, I just want to talk about this bit for a little bit, because to us, that piece seemed just very straightforward and unsurprising. Air Canada had to get an accessibility plan out and published anyway. It makes sense that they would then, use part of that accessibility plan to talk about how they're going to accommodate and make air travel more accessible for persons who use mobility devices. However, on appeal, Air Canada actually challenged that in particular, and said that was an overreach by the agency. And notably, at the same time, it was making all of these public messages about how important their accessibility plan is to Air Canada and how it was going to be doing everything it could to expedite its accessibility plan. So that was particularly striking to see kind of the public messaging on accessibility versus what it was really arguing in the courts at the same time. But the rest of the decision was pretty straightforward. Like this is very established human rights law. The Federal Court of Appeals said nothing that was surprising. It pointed out quite rightly that the size of the enterprise needs to be relevant. So Air Canada is our flag carrier. It makes a whole lot of money. And so it's not, it needs to be able to actually tangibly prove why an accommodation measure would amount to undue hardship. And ultimately, Air Canada wasn't able to do that. So it's nice to have that affirmation, and at least, because it did go up to the Federal Court of Appeal, it is binding law. So that is, in terms of legal practice and precedent, that is a lot more helpful to members of the disability community than a decision of the agency.
Absolutely. Tim, how are organizations like Arch Disability really life-changing?
I mean, I would not have gotten very far without Arch. Like, I'll just be really blunt about it. The reality is that the legal system is complicated. It's designed to be complicated, and it's designed to make you feel empowered and kind of powerless at the same time. And what I mean by that is it's very difficult to navigate if you don't know what levers to pull on. And so organizations like Arch and other well-established advocacy organizations that have been speaking up for people with disabilities for a very long time and know how to do it and know how to do it well are critical to ensuring the rights of people with disabilities more broadly are protected. And without organizations like Arch and without organizations like Arch being funded publicly, we cannot ensure that there is kind of arm's length public accountability for organizations to take advantage of people with disabilities. So, I mean, I can't understate, and I'm not just saying this because Ilinca's on the call, I cannot understate how important organizations like Arch have been, not only to the community as a whole, but to myself personally, obviously, over the last 8 years.
Yeah, we all technically have the right to, take things to the court. It's just very difficult to do so without the correct representation.
Right.
Kind of a philosophical question, kind of for each of you to wrap this up. Tim, as we mentioned at the beginning, pretty many people in the disability community have horror stories about flying. Almost everyone has humiliating or undignified treatment that they've experienced. Do you think we are on the right path now or getting closer to the right path?
I mean, I would say, Grant, that I think we are getting closer to the right path. I do not think yet we are on the right path, and I only say that because there's still so many other issues, not only for wheelchair users, but for other individuals with disabilities who experience discrimination in flying. And the other thing to keep in mind is that this decision is only one airline, right? So like until we get industry-wide change, I'm not going to say that we are on the right path. And the fact that it took myself as an individual and 8 years of my own sweat equity and 8 years of Arch's sweat equity, and I am a educated, privileged male. And so I recognize those privileges, and I think for me, I won't say we're on the right path. I would say we are closer to the right path.
Thank you. Ilinca, anything you would like to add to that? Or also just if people need representation, how can they move forward with that?
Of course. So I'll start with, so I do echo Tim. I think one thing that shows me that we are on the right path is, that this decision and the hearing at the Federal Court of Appeal, like it wasn't controversial. In past decisions, I mean lawyers, like if you go back to some of the big disability rights decisions, a lot of the time was spent actually arguing about, do people with disabilities have inherent dignity, or should people be able to travel? Should there be, is there that right to autonomy and independence? And, to actually go up and argue this case along with my colleagues, and, not having to make any of those arguments, to have the three judges of the Federal Court of Appeal be able to actually talk about some of the technical legal arguments instead of wasting time on some of the more philosophical questions. That really shows me that we're on the right path, but certainly there is a very, very long way to go.
Ilinca, how can people reach out to Arch Disability Law?
Sure. So anyone can give us a call at 416-482-8255, toll free at 1-866-482-2724, or TTY at 416-482-1254.
Tim, Ilinca, thank you so much for sharing your story and joining us today on The Pulse.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
The Pulse airs on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 1 p.m. Eastern on AMI Audio, repeating every 6 hours. You can also catch the show on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Grant Hardy. Thanks so much for listening.